Welcome to the Pianist TV channel. In this following masterclass, Graham Fitch discusses the importance of playing technical exercises. The filming takes place at Steinway Hall, right in the heart of London. Before Graham begins his lesson, here's a glance around Steinway's impressive showroom and Hall of Fame, as well as the all-important workshop. On this introduction, Graham plays the Allemande from Rameau's Suite in A minor on a Model D concert grand, the same instrument on which he gives his lesson.
Hello, I'm Graham Fitch and I'm bringing you this video demonstration on exercises from Steinway Hall in London. What I'm going to talk about today is technical exercises that we might do before we start to practice, which are generally called warm-ups. We also can use exercises to build our technique in the first place, and those can be the same exercises. Before I get into them, I just want to talk very quickly, very briefly about the history of exercises, because there's a little bit of confusion in certain people's minds about whether we should do these things or not, particularly hannon exercises. Now, some people do them religiously every day, and other people don't believe in them at all. So there seem to be two camps here. But if you look back into the history of piano technique, the history of piano playing, we will discover that the early piano technique came out of harpsichord technique, which of course was the forerunner of our modern piano. The piano itself has evolved over the years. So to try and approach the evolving piano with the same technique that was actually very suitable for the harpsichord and the early pianos, that would be nonsense. And it took a little while for pianists to realize, hang on a minute, this instrument's getting bigger, the touch weight is getting heavier, the demands made on the performer and on the instrument were increasing. We'd better rethink the way that we approach it. I know, let's just have loads of finger exercises to make the fingers stronger. The idea in those days was that we kept the arm quiet by our side and we used finger strokes from here. The problem is, of course, that while hannon exercises may be very useful if they're done well, a lot of the exercises that we might do can be extremely useful if they're done well. It's how we do them that's important, and I'd like to put a great red line under that statement. How we do them, not so much what we do. So while hannon exercises may very well be dangerous if they're done in the conventional way, which is this, see those piston fingers, that encourages the hand to play with just the finger. It does not take into account the other ways of moving at the keyboard, but I'm going to show you in a little bit how we can jailbreak hannon and use the patterns, because they are patterns of notes, how we can use them to our advantage and for variety, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. So going back to my story about the history of piano playing, let's call that the finger school. After the finger school, people realized, yes, we can't do it all with our fingers. The arm school, what we might call the arm school, all the relaxation, that came in, and they forgot about the fingers. So what we got is from one extreme to the other. People were flopping around all over the keyboard with this relaxed arm weight and no sound. Now, modern piano playing has put the two back together, fortunately. So now what we get is an awareness that, of course, we need good fingers. We need very strong fingers, and we need very loose arms, absolutely. And we need intelligence, and we need to use our brains, and we need to use our ears. So that's what I'd say first of all. All of these exercises have to be done with attention to quality of sound, quality of movement. Tension has no place in any type of piano playing. And we have to really be listening and thinking about what we're doing. So mindless repetition is absolutely out. So with that all in mind, and I did want to stress that before I start, I do like a regimen of warm-ups that I will only use this if I'm not warm already. If I've been playing a lot the day before, I won't do this. But I do teach these because for the developing pianist, it's a very good plan to have exercises that stretch, in other words, extensions. Now, I'm going to show you 2 or 3 extensions. This is the one favoured by Adele Marcus, very famous, great piano teacher. She liked a diminished 7th chord. What I'm going to do now is lift my 2nd finger up high, straight, bring it down curved. Feel the stretch there, bring it down. Now you'll notice that I'm making a little movement here. You don't have to make that movement. I'm simply making the movement to show you that I'm physically very loose the moment I reach the key bed. And yet there's a certain grip there too. I can do that with each finger in turn, and I can do combinations of fingers. Stretch, stretch. Another stretching exercise I particularly like, let me show you in the left hand. This I wouldn't suggest for a small hand. I've got quite a large hand, so I'm going to do a common chord. Notice that my thumb is dangling off the edge of the keyboard, and I can take advantage of this moment just to stretch my thumb out. Now, this is already a nice stretch in my hand. I like to do this in addition. Take each finger for a walk. Now the 4th finger. I'm moving a semitone each time, where possible. I might not be able to manage it. For example, I don't want to stretch toward that B, so I just don't do it. That's very important, not to overstretch. That can be injurious. Another aspect of warm-ups or technique building is what's known as 5-finger exercises. I'm going to show you how to adapt hannon. I'm going to start off with, I love to do exercises for finger independence. And I'm known for using finger patterns other than the obvious C major. I avoid C major because I can't think of a piece of music that avoids black notes. So even with exercises, we're incorporating black keys. That's the Chopin position, either that or I like this. It becomes a whole tone position. What I'll do is I might decide to hold my 3rd finger at rest in the bottom of the key. And play the other fingers around it. Try that at home. It's not as easy as it looks. And in various combinations, let's say I hold down 2 and 4. I could hold down any combination. How about 1 and 4? And I could do them staccato. Now, you're not going to get patterns like that in real music. This comes down to the training of the hand. It's something that's really important in developing a pianist, training the hand. And for me, independence exercises are extremely important in that. Now, moving on to hannon. Let's look at how we can use a hannon pattern for choreography. Now, at the keyboard, we're using, I've said this before and I'm going to say it again, the risk of repeating myself. We do not play the piano with our fingers. We need good fingers, but we're using movements of our wrist. We're using movements here from our rotation. I'm using circular movements of my arm. I might be using thrusting movements of my arm. Let's see if we can use our hannon patterns to apply that. Let me show you this way. I'm just off the top of my head going to illustrate a few that you might do. Let's avoid C major. Drop the wrist, drop, up, 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 down, up, up, up. And that becomes my undulating arm. That's a very useful way of using that pattern. I also might use that same pattern for a circular movement this way. You see how that unlocks my wrist and mobilizes my arm. I can even feel it mobilized from the shoulder. Now, the hannon, I think it's number 5. I'm not a great believer in hannon, I don't mind saying, but I do like to use these patterns for my own devious ends. And I think number 5 lends itself, it could be number 6. Excuse me if this is number 6. Do you see what I'm doing there? I'm using forearm rotation to manage that pattern. I'm doing it in C major. I'm going against my principles. See what I'm doing there? I'm not using my fingers as per Hannon's instructions. I'm using this, but I'm using the pattern that Hannon gave us. So any 5-finger exercise can be useful if it's done sensibly, properly. Any of them can be damaging if they're done badly. So moving on from 5 fingers, I think another component of a regime, scales and arpeggios. And I don't need to say anything specific about scales and arpeggios here because I have talked about them elsewhere, but I would like to give you a couple of ideas for scales. Let's say you decide to do, with perhaps a metronome, 1 octave in quarter notes, in crotchets. Now 2 octaves, gliding on. 3 octaves. And so on. I went from crotchets or quarter notes to quavers, to triplet quavers, to semiquavers, with the same pulse underneath. That's a very good way of warming up, actually. It's also a very good way of developing speed in scales. I think a really good way with arpeggios is to pick one note, doesn't matter which one it is, find a different one each day, and play all the arpeggios that can be derived from that one note. So let's say I take D, D major, G minor, B flat major, G minor, G major, and then I could go into the dominant sevenths, play all the dominant sevenths that use the D. Notice I was changing only one note at a time. That's very good for the brain, very good for the fingers, excellent way of warming up, and an excellent way of just testing your arpeggios and the inversions, whether you can really just manage them like that. Now, moving on to double notes, which I consider to be really, really important to be part of the daily routine. And again, it almost doesn't matter what you do. As long as you do something to do with double notes, I am going to just demonstrate the exercise that I showed you already in a previous demonstration, just because it's as good as anything else, which is this. I start off major, minor, into the next key, and so on. If you're not warmed up and you'd like to do that a little more carefully, a little more slowly, you can always use arm movements, wrist movements down. And as you get faster, that will feel as though the wrist is sprung. You're not doing it from here. The other important thing about double notes is to enable the lateral. Let me just show you the wrist here. This is not good, because I'm using all my fingers. See what I'm doing there? Just allowing a little bit of lateral freedom. The next component of a regime, warm-up or technical regime, is something to do with octaves. Now you can do scales in octaves, arpeggios in octaves. There are plenty of exercises and studies in octaves, so I don't want to burden you with that. When I was a student, I had to play the Bach inventions, the two-part inventions in octaves, which is, again, a very useful exercise. And I'm sure Bach wouldn't have minded. I mean, he wrote these pieces for educational purposes, so I don't think he'd mind if we converted them. And so on. Some of them would be more four-arm octaves. Others might lend themselves to more wristy, and so on. We can, anything that's in two parts, we can make octaves. Chords is the next and almost final. Anything to do with chords is good. For the younger player, just triads. Did you notice I gave that a shape? I gave it the quality of rising to the top and falling. To make it, again, attention to good sound. For bigger pianists, this is a very good exercise. Then minor, up chromatically until you've gone through all the keys. That's a fantastic way to warm up and to build strength and stamina. So it's effort, release. Finally, a lovely exercise that I like to do for really loosening the arm and connecting the hand to the shoulder. It's an extended arpeggio with this fingering. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like a big wheel. And again, through all the keys. When I come to my fifth finger, my thumb is under my hand. Let me show you in the left hand. That almost feels as good as a massage. It absolutely opens us here and connects us to a lovely feeling of looseness and relaxation. I hope that's given you some ideas as to how you might warm up or how you might build your technique. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.